Hi. Thanks so much for coming, everyone. It genuinely is lovely to see you all here. Do keep coming in and do keep grabbing sandwiches on the way and find yourself a seat. My name's Lily, and I would love to give you a really warm welcome to this week's Big Questions. Big Questions is a space where you can ask and discuss and investigate questions about life and its meaning and the claims of Jesus. So today, the question we're looking at is, why does it matter if Jesus rose from the dead? Across the UK and beyond, around the world, Easter has been celebrated as an international festival just a couple of weeks ago. The core of the message of Easter is that a man named Jesus died and then came back to life. So we would like to invite you to consider, does it even matter if this is true? We're going to have a short talk that's going to be followed by a time for questions, so do be texting in questions to the numbers you can see on the pillars here and on the front. Now, I am delighted to introduce you to our speaker, Stuart Browning. Stuart studied Natski here at Selwyn College. Don't know if we've got any Selwyn people. And then he went down to Bristol University to study theology, and he's now back. He's a member of the clergy at Holy Trinity Church just down the road. So, without further ado, let's give Stuart a warm welcome.
Hi guys, really good to be with you. Thank you for inviting me, and looking forward to this topic of the resurrection. And when it comes to questions, feel free to text anything in. I do aspire to be very hard to offend. So just go for it and we'll see where we go. So, great. So the topic this lunchtime is the resurrection. Why does it matter? And the team have asked me to speak particularly on, the implications of the resurrection. So there's lots that could be said about the evidence. I want to mention a few things, but hopefully by the end of this talk, even if you've got a bit more digging to do, you're convinced that it matters whether the resurrection happened or not, and we can chat more about it after that. Great, so why don't we start right at the beginning? What is the resurrection? What are Christians talking about when they talk about Jesus rising from the dead? So let's start with the non-controversial part of the story. Roughly 33 AD, there was this Jewish rabbi called Jesus of Nazareth, who was executed by an alliance of the Romans and the Jewish leaders of the time, sort of roughly on the charges of blasphemy and of being the Jewish Messiah. First, he was flogged and beaten, and he was then force-marched to the public execution spot, which they regularly use just outside of the city of Jerusalem. And he was nailed through the arms and the legs to a wooden frame, left there to essentially suffocate over the day. And at the end of it, his executioners, Roman executioners, whose lives probably depended on getting these kind of things right, they pronounced him dead after checking. They stuck him with a spear, and then his followers buried him. And that's all that's kind of relatively non-controversial in historical terms. There was a great little quote from Tom Holland, who's the atheist. He's a popular historian, written a number of books, and he writes for The Spectator. And just a week ago, he wrote this. There are 4 detailed accounts of the process by which a man might be sentenced to death and then suffer his punishment. And these have survived from antiquity. These accounts are to be found, of course, in the New Testament. There is no reason to doubt their essentials. Even the most skeptical historians have tended to accept them. So Tom Holland thinks that those 4 accounts of the execution of Jesus are relatively uncontroversial. But the controversial bit begins straight after that, in what these accounts claim about what happened afterwards. 3 days later, people began to report that Jesus had been seen alive. First, the woman who went to his tomb to embalm him, which doesn't show a great, sense of expectation about the whole thing. They went to embalm him. They found the tomb empty. And one of the women claims she bumped into him in the garden surrounding the tomb. Then 2 of the disciples said that they'd encountered this Jesus alive on the road just outside of Jerusalem. Then he began to appear to larger groups of his disciples, first 10, then 11 of them, and eventually to a group as large as 500. And each time, the accounts were the same, that this Jesus was alive, that he had a physical body, that he could eat and be touched, and he even had the scars of his execution. And then after a few days of encouraging and meeting with his disciples, he commissioned them, and he visibly ascended from sight. And so the church began. Those group of witnesses who claimed to have seen this went out to tell everybody about this event. Now you might ask, okay, thank you very much for explaining this all to me. Why do you drag out the details of this? Why go on and on about what happened? And the first reason, I guess, is just so that we're all on the same page about what we're talking about. But the second reason I just run over those details of the first eyewitness accounts is because those first witnesses dragged out these details themselves. A huge proportion of the accounts of Jesus' life are dedicated to Jesus' death and his resurrection. Because it really, really mattered to the early Christians, to these first witnesses, that this actually happened. This was a historical account, that they'd seen this firsthand. For them, this wasn't just an idea. It wasn't a metaphor, some beautiful picture of how life comes after death, or, rain comes after shine. It wasn't some general principle that they wanted to speak about, some spiritual principle. They staked their lives on the fact that they had watched their friend and their leader be executed, and that they had seen him alive afterwards, 3 days later. So that's what we're talking about, the claim that this Jesus rose from the dead, physically and bodily. But why does it matter? What does it change if this is true? Well, the Apostle Paul says that it is all important. It makes all the difference. You cannot take the resurrection out of Christianity and be left with anything worthy of the name. He says, if Christ has not been raised, our preaching is useless, and so is your faith. It's a big challenge. And I'd like to suggest for the rest of this talk that the resurrection works in every direction. It challenges and it makes a difference to how we see the past, how we see the present, and how we see the future. And I'm going to briefly just look at what the resurrection does in those three angles. If you are willing to come with me, well, that's where I'm going. First of all, it makes a difference looking backwards. It makes a difference looking backwards because the resurrection makes us reconsider the rest of the claims of Jesus, the rest of the claims of Jesus about his life and about his death. Many people have made many very extraordinary claims about themselves over history. If you want 15 minutes of light amusement, you might just type in Kanye West quotes about himself. That will be a good 15 minutes. My particular favorite of Kanye West's quotes is this: I am God's vessel. My greatest pain in life is that I will never be able to see myself perform live. And there are many along that line. It's quite good. So many people have made really extraordinary claims about themselves, haven't they? But in fact, very few people have made more claimed more about themselves than Jesus did. Here are just 3 claims that Jesus made, all from John's Gospel. He claimed to represent God. He said in John 14, anyone who has seen me has seen the Father. He claimed to speak on behalf of God. He said, for I did not speak on my own, but the Father who sent me commanded me to say all that I have spoken. That's from John 12. And he also claims to be the only way to God. He says, I am the way and the truth and the life, and no one comes to the Father except through me. And these are absolutely huge claims, aren't they? And why should we believe them? Why should we believe Jesus rather than Kanye West, for example? Many people of Jesus' own day didn't believe him. It was, in fact, the charge of blasphemy, as I said before, that sealed Jesus' death warrant before the Sanhedrin. And it does seem to me that on their own, without the resurrection, many of Jesus' claims are very implausible. But of course, if he rose from the dead, we have to reconsider him and his claims and his life and his death. I know when I talk to people about the resurrection, what do they think about it? A lot of people say to me, look, I just don't believe Jesus could rise from the dead. Why? Because I don't believe in God. I don't believe in a God or spirit or a spiritual world or anything like that. So if I don't believe in that, how can I believe that Jesus rose from the dead? Well, I'd like to flip it around the other way. I think it's more helpful to ask, if Jesus rose from the dead, what does that mean about the fact that he claimed to be God, to speak on behalf of God, to represent him, to be the way to God? If Jesus rose from the dead, we have to reconsider what he said about himself. For me, the real question is, did Jesus rise from the dead? One of the most convincing arguments there are many, but one that convinces me the most is the fact that all of those who claim to see him alive after his death were willing to go to their deaths for claiming that. They stake their lives on this. There's a great quote by a guy called Charles Colson. He was a special counsel to US President Nixon. He was the guy right alongside Nixon throughout the famous Watergate scandal. He went to prison for being part of that, and he became a Christian there, and he wrote this: "I know the resurrection is a fact, and Watergate proved it to me. How? Because 12 men testified that they had seen Jesus raised from the dead. Then they proclaimed that truth for 40 years, never once denying it. Everyone was beaten, tortured, stoned, and put in prison. They would not have endured it if it weren't true. Watergate embroiled 12 of the most powerful men in the world, and they couldn't keep it alive for 3 weeks. You're telling me 12 apostles could keep it alive for 40 years? Absolutely impossible." That was what Charles Colson said. I say, if Jesus rose from the dead, what does that mean about who he claimed to be? But also, Jesus' resurrection makes us reconsider Jesus' claim about his death as well, and particularly his death. Jesus said some amazing things about his own death. He said in John 10, "No one takes my life from me, but I lay it down of my own accord. I have authority to lay it down, and I have authority to take it up again." And at the Last Supper he had with his disciples, just before he went to the cross, he sat down and he explained to them the meaning of his death. And he said this to them: "This is my blood, which is poured out for many for the forgiveness of sins." Now, before the resurrection, this all just seems a little bit odd, doesn't it? Jesus saying things about the fact that he willingly gives his life, that his death is going to bring forgiveness for us, those kinds of things. Well, before the resurrection, why should we think that he's the Messiah rather than he just has a Messiah complex? And there are many, many people around the world, even today, who go to their deaths, even in martyrdom, believing extraordinary things about what their deaths will achieve. But how do we know whether they're true or not? Surely it's just much easier to think, well, this was just a huge miscalculation. Jesus just bit off more than he could chew, took on the establishment, and he lost. Why should we believe anything he said about his death? But after his resurrection, everything changes, doesn't it? After the resurrection, if we believe it, if we see it, we begin to realize that all along he had the kind of power, like the power of rising from the dead. If he has the power to rise from the dead, we have to ask, what on earth was he doing getting himself killed in the first place? There are easier ways to live than getting yourself killed and rising from the dead. Yeah? And we have to begin to ask, is it plausible that he willingly went to the cross for us, willingly, and that it was for our forgiveness, and that it worked? Maybe, just maybe, it's true if Jesus rose from the dead. So it makes a difference to how we look backwards, particularly at Jesus, but it also makes a difference to our present, how we live now as well. And that's because the resurrection means Jesus is still alive. The resurrection means Jesus is still alive. Might sound a bit odd, but it seems to me a rather inescapable conclusion if Jesus rose from the dead and then he ascended to his Father's right hand, as we're told. So a couple of implications if Jesus is still alive. Number one, Jesus is still active and at work in the world. One of the accounts of Jesus' life is written by someone called Luke. Luke's Gospel, that's the one written by Luke. And he also wrote a second account called Acts, which is the account of the early church, basically what happened after Jesus ascended. And he begins that second account with these lines. In my former book, I wrote about all that Jesus began to do and teach until the day he was taken up to heaven. Anyone pick that up? In my former book, I wrote about everything Jesus began to do and teach. What's the implication? He's like, my first book, I wrote about what he began to do when he was on earth. Now read my second book about what he's continuing to do as he's seated at the right hand of God in heaven. And it's absolutely key to what Christians believe today, that Jesus is still alive and he's still at work in this world. And I could tell you story after story of examples that I've seen in my life. I'm sure many people around the tables could as well. I could tell you about my brother, little brother, who was healed of profound deafness at the age of 6 months. He was diagnosed, prayed for, and then he was healed. Or I could tell you about a friend of mine who felt God called him to lead a church, but there was no money to pay for him to lead the church. But he said, right, okay, well, I feel like God's spoken to me, so I'm gonna stay here, and I'm just going to trust that if God has actually spoken to me, he can provide. And a month later, his wife came out of their front door and found £100,000 in cash in a black bag on their front doorstep. Or you could go down the road and speak to our vicar's wife down at HT, and she could tell you about how she became a Christian when, as a drug addict, she cried out to God for help, and she was instantaneously delivered from completely otherwise inescapable addictions. And I could just go on. I could go on, and I'd love to chat if you want to hear more about things I've seen God do. And there are lots of other stories. So Jesus is still alive and at work. But these are not crazy things when you compare them to what Luke records God doing in the book of Acts. But another implication of Jesus being alive is maybe slightly closer to home, which is that we can actually get to know him. We can have a personal relationship with Jesus. If you've been around Christians for any length of time, you might have heard the Christians talking in this kind of language. Oh, you can know Jesus, you can have a relationship with him. You can love Jesus. Well, what does that all mean? How can you have a genuine two-way relationship with a dead historical figure? I don't think you really can. But that's not what Christians believe about Jesus. I've been studying John chapter 20 for a sermon that's coming up on Sunday. And one of the things that really struck me is that after Jesus' resurrection, one of the characters, Mary Magdalene, she bumps into him in the garden. And she's having this conversation with him. She's holding on to him. She's talking with him, crying with him. And it just struck me as I was reading that, like, wow, that means that after the resurrection, Jesus was bump-intable. He was knowable, and they could talk to him. Jesus is not an artifact of history preserved only in a written code that we learn about. He's alive. And the extraordinary invitation at the heart of Christianity is that the Jesus that we read about in the scriptures is alive and calls us into a living relationship with him. We really can get to know him, follow him, talk with him, love him, trust him, see him at work in the world in the same way those first disciples did. If you want evidence of the resurrection, definitely go to the scriptures, go to the accounts of his life. Definitely go and analyze the historical arguments and that stands up to scrutiny. But also, why don't you come to church and speak to people, many people who know him and have seen him at work in this world. So the resurrection makes a difference for today, the present. as well, because Jesus is still alive. And then finally, Jesus' resurrection makes a difference for the future. It makes a huge difference to how we see the future. And I'm sort of running out of time, so I'm going to stick to just one element of this, which is this. If Jesus rose from the dead, it means that death isn't the end. It means that death isn't the end for us. Jesus said to his disciples in John chapter 6, verse 40, "This is the will of him who sent me, that everyone who sees the Son and believes in him has eternal life, and I shall raise him up on the last day." And I shall raise him on the last day. Now, what would Jesus have to do to make us trust him with this extraordinary promise? I mean, it's quite outlandish. I mean, just like the rest of claims of Jesus, it's quite outlandish on its own. If I was going to trust someone who said that they could see me through to the other side of death, I would want some sort of evidence that they had the ability to do that. That they could do that themselves would be a good, do that for themselves would be a good sign. I love that in the accounts in John's Gospel, the disciple Thomas is also not convinced that Jesus is able to do this until he sees him, until he sees the risen Jesus standing in front of him. And Jesus says to him, "You can put your hands in my side. You can feel the holes in my holes in my hands and in my side and in my feet." And it's at that moment when he sees it, when he sees the risen Jesus in front of him, he realizes that this Jesus has the power over life and death, that he's been through it and come out the other side. And he not only realizes it, but he throws himself in, he entrusts himself into Jesus' hands. He says to him, "My Lord, my God," and he worships him. And I've run out of time. If you want to ask questions about this, I'd love to say more about it. But if the resurrection of Jesus is true, it literally changes everything. You know, the possibility that if we entrust ourselves into Jesus' hands, that he might bodily raise us from the dead for a future with him. I mean, that, just begin thinking about it, it just utterly cracks open our reality. It's like, you know, you thought you had a term to revise and then you had eternity. It like totally changes the game. It's like everything changes if life proceeds beyond death. Everything we know about the world changes. All kinds of hope opens up. And it would take another 10 talks to unpack that. And so, to finish, the bodily resurrection of Jesus makes all the difference. In every direction, it brings us confidence in who Jesus said he was and in the power of his death for us to bring us close to God. It enables us to know him alive and at work today, and it means that we can trust him with our futures, even our own deaths, and also with the future of this world. So I'm going to leave it there and ask any questions you want to.
Great, thank you so much, Stuart. That was really helpful. Do keep texting in questions to the numbers on the pillars. We've got just a couple of minutes now for you to text in questions and start discussing around your tables. What did you agree with? What did you disagree with? What was new? What was unexpected in that? We'll be back in a few minutes. Sorry to cut those conversations short. Do continue your conversations afterwards, after our questions, but we're going to have a short time of questions now. Great. We've had some questions texted in, some really great questions. Just before we get on to those, are there any questions from the floor people would like to give? We have a roving mic. Toby will run if you make him. Otherwise, we'll go on to the questions on here. Okay, cool. Let's get going with these questions. So, Stuart, why does the power to be raised from the dead mean that Jesus' claims are validated? I think this refers to the claims you're talking about from John. Does power automatically equal godliness and truthfulness? That's a great question.
Why does power? Good question. Great question. Why does what aspect of the resurrection, this is what I'm hearing the question is, what aspect of the resurrection means that it vindicates what he says about himself? I think the question is right. I think in getting at something here, which is sort of like, does the resurrection tell us everything about Jesus? I'd say no. Power alone does not show us everything about Jesus. I think it's not like suddenly the resurrection on its own, bang, makes us see the rest of Jesus' life completely differently. Right? There are lots of aspects of Jesus' life which you'd have to read in context to see. I personally think that if you go away and read Jesus' teachings just on their own and you read them, I think they're absolutely extraordinary. Some people have said, well, maybe the Gospels were just totally made up. Well, there's lots of reasons why that isn't true. One of the strongest arguments for me is I don't know who could make up his teachings, quite frankly. I don't know what group of people could make them up. I've never come across anything more extraordinary. So I wouldn't say the resurrection on its own suddenly vindicates everything. But I would say that we see that the disciples themselves when Jesus died, they didn't know what to do with it. There were lots of people who thought they'd found the Messiah in first century Judea, and they followed them. But when your Messiah got killed, you just decided you picked the wrong person. I mean, what do you do with someone? Many people have made extraordinary claims. When that person appears to you alive, I don't know how. It's not just the power. It's just the sheer fact of it that you have to start reconsidering everything else. So, no, I wouldn't say that power shows godliness in and of itself, but it's certainly an indicator, and taken in the wider context of everything Jesus does and says, his character, his teaching, I think it's a very compelling argument.
Great. We've got a challenge for you here. Imagine someone similar in character to the disciple Thomas. How can you ever convince him now of the resurrection if he was unwilling to believe even then?
Ah, great.
Got what, 2 minutes?
Yeah. Well, it's great because in that little bit in John 20, just after Thomas is doubting, then sees Jesus, Jesus says, well, blessed are you because you saw, but blessed are more those who have not seen and still believe. And to some extent, we have to take the disciples' words. We have to take them at their word when we read it. So a really important question is, are these accounts historically accurate? That we've got some great books on that. It's worth investigating. Is what Peter saw, do I have to see what Peter saw, or can I trust that Peter saw it? And a first step is to ask, can I trust what Peter and Thomas and these guys saw? And that's worth investigating in and of itself. But then I'd say that there are other parts to the puzzle, seeing what they did with their lives afterwards. And as I said, the element of Jesus still being alive, coming to church, talking to Christians who know Jesus, seeing him at work, those kinds of things. So I think it's a combination. I don't think we're supposed to just shut off our logic, step off a plank, and believe. I think there are good reasons. But I think at the same time, if you choose not to believe, you can always find a reason not to. And actually, you need to set yourself free to really weigh up the evidence and go with it. It's much more like a court case, looking at it, seeing what's plausible, gathering from a wide range of angles, and then going for it. And the great thing is that we can know Jesus. It does, there's the evidence, and then there's my relationship with God, and the two go hand in hand. Yeah, there's lots more could be said. It's a great question.
Cool. This question will probably have a similar answer, so feel free to treat it briefly, but do add anything if you want.
Yeah.
You say that I think the early Christians died because they so strongly believed in the cross, but surely a lot of people die for things that are wrong. How can we use that as evidence?
Yeah, great. Yeah, lots of people do die for things that are wrong. Yeah. Well, I think what is extraordinary, people die for things that are wrong for a bunch of reasons, don't they? One of them is because they think they're true, but they're not. So essentially, they think it's true, but they're deluded. So a good question to ask is it plausible that the early disciples were deluded? Well, looking at the range of such a wide number of people, if we had one person saying, I saw Jesus alive, it's not going to stand. But we have hundreds of people who are accounting for. The Apostle Paul writing, he says, I'm telling you these stories, most of these people are still alive. You can go and check these stories with people who are alive. They saw it. So we have a large number of people over a long period of time in groups, things like that. You really have to ask, is it plausible that they were deluded? And that seems to be very implausible. So then the question really becomes, did they die for something they knew was a lie? Now, I think you might live for something that you knew was a lie. You might say, well, look, this is a lie, but it really serves me because it puts me at the center of, this amazing religion. It's not hard for us to imagine that people might invent things like that. But I'm not sure how many people would die for a lie. And most of those witnesses, the 10 out of the 11 by tradition of the disciples, were martyred, as in they were put in front of, and they said, if you recant, we won't kill you. Well, it's amazing how they didn't. And so I think it's different argument entirely to say they died for a lie. And I think it's very, very implausible. Lots more could be said, but yeah.
Cool, yes, and do come back on that if you want to chat more to Stuart about that. Finally, we've had a couple of questions on a similar theme, so I'd love to put these to you. How has your life been personally changed by knowing Jesus? What does it actually look like to meet Jesus?
Oh my. Those are huge questions, aren't they? About all kinds of things. I've mentioned some stories of things I've seen God do in a kind of miraculous sense, but I don't want to give the impression that is like everyday experience. I've just sort of picked them out as like particular things that stick out as stories. I've got lots more of that. But day to day, my relationship with God looks like spending time with God in the morning, talking to Him, reading His Word, and it's putting a time aside to learn to listen to Him. I do think that's possible. I have an entire talk on what that looks like and what it doesn't look like. But I think it's about seeing God at work in other people's lives. And I'm very privileged. I oversee the student work at HT, just down the road, Holy Trinity, just down the road. And I get to watch as God just transforms people's lives. I get to watch as people come in, some people with, it's not all like from desperate to great. Sometimes it's from great to better. But I watch people go from just enormous burdens of anxiety to just finding incredible peace as God. People watching people get there who have addictions come free from that, or issues with bodies, relationships, or just all kinds of things. Jesus has something to say about every part of life. And one of the things that most convinces me is watching Him at work in other people's lives and how He always brings life. He always brings good things. So, for me, there's the personal side of things. There's seeing Him do extraordinary things, which is part of that. There's seeing Him at work as well in other people's lives. And, there's lots. Many books.
Cool. Thank you so much, Stuart. Let's give him one more round of applause.